What happens when a simple game of hide-and-seek turns into a deadly encounter? A question that would haunt investigators and leave a community in shock. Welcome to the Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host Sean Dupree, and today we're diving into one of the most bizarre murder cases that has recently rocked Orange County, Florida. A suitcase, a couple's drunken game, and a cell phone video that would ultimately reveal the chilling truth behind a man's final moments. What really happened on that fateful night in February 2020? And how did Sarah Boone's claims of self-defense stack up against the disturbing evidence? Stay with me as we unpack this haunting case that proves sometimes the most dangerous games are the ones we never meant to play. In the quiet suburb of Winter Park, Florida, Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres seemed like any other couple to their neighbors. But behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but ordinary. Their story was marked by a troubling pattern of domestic violence that would eventually lead to a tragic end. The couple's history revealed a complex web of abuse and violence. Both Boone and Torres had previous arrests for domestic violence-related charges. Their volatile relationship had even resulted in a no-contact order being placed against Torres at one point, though they continued their relationship despite these red flags. What makes this case particularly compelling is how their troubled past would later become central to the defense's strategy. But was their relationship truly as one-sided as it would later be portrayed in court? The evidence would paint a much more complicated picture. Living in their Winter Park residence, Boone and Torres's relationship continued to deteriorate. Police records show multiple domestic disturbance calls to their address, yet they remained together. Friends and family would later testify about witnessing concerning behavior from both parties, but no one could have predicted how their toxic relationship would ultimately end. As we approached February 23, 2020, the couple's relationship had reached a breaking point. Their pattern of alcohol-fueled arguments and physical confrontations was about to take a turn that would shock even veteran law enforcement officers. But what exactly pushed this troubled relationship over the edge? And could this tragedy have been prevented? The night of February 23, 2020, began like many others for Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres with drinking. The couple had been consuming alcohol throughout the evening when they decided to play what they would later describe as a game of hide-and-seek. But this wasn't your typical childhood game. This was a decision that would lead to devastating consequences. What happened next would be captured in disturbing cell phone footage that would later become crucial evidence. Torres, whether by choice or coercion, ended up inside a suitcase. The blue hard-shell case, barely large enough for an adult, became his final resting place. But how did a supposedly playful moment turn so dark? In the video footage recovered from Boone's phone, we hear Torres's increasingly desperate pleas. "I can't breathe, Sarah," he called out repeatedly from inside the suitcase. His voice, muffled but clearly distressed, can be heard begging for help. But instead of assistance, he was met with taunts and accusations. "That's what you do when you choke me," Boone's voice rings out in the recording. "Oh, that's what I feel like when you cheat on me." The video reveals the chilling transformation of what was supposedly a game into something far more sinister. But what was really going through Boone's mind in those moments? According to Boone's later testimony, she claimed to have seen Torres's hand emerge from the suitcase, triggering memories of past abuse. She admitted to striking his hand with a baseball bat, allegedly fearing he would attack her if he escaped. But does this account align with the evidence? Why did she continue recording instead of helping? As the night wore on, Boone claims she went to sleep, leaving Torres in the suitcase. She maintained she believed he could get out on his own. But with each breath Torres took inside that confined space, the oxygen levels decreased, as medical experts would later testify. The suitcase, meant for storage and travel, had become a death trap. The videos show Torres's final documented moments trapped, pleading, and growing increasingly desperate. But what happened in the hours between these recordings and the next morning? And why didn't anyone intervene during this fatal night? When Sarah Boone called 911 the next morning, her story seemed straightforward enough. She told detectives they had been playing a drunken game of hide and seek, and she had simply fallen asleep, thinking Torres could free himself from the suitcase. But as investigators would soon discover, there was much more to this tragic story than a game gone wrong. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives examined Boone's cell phone. What they found sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Multiple videos showing Torres's desperate situation. These weren't the recordings of a playful game, but rather documented evidence of his final moments, complete with Boone's taunting responses to his pleas for help. The medical examiner's findings painted an even grimmer picture. Torres's body told the story of his final struggle. His back and neck were covered in scratches, evidence of his desperate attempts to escape the confines of the suitcase. The contusions found on his shoulder, skull, and forehead suggested significant blunt force trauma. Perhaps most telling was the cut near his busted lip, raising questions about what really transpired that night. But what puzzled investigators most was the timeline. Between the videos showing Torres alive and distressed in the suitcase, and the 911 call the next morning, crucial hours had passed. What happened during this gap? And why didn't Boone check on him during the night? The evidence seemed to contradict her initial statement about simply falling asleep and forgetting about him. As detectives pieced together the evidence, the videos, the autopsy findings, and Boone's changing statements, they began to see a pattern emerging. This wasn't a tragic accident as initially claimed, but something far more deliberate. The question was no longer about what happened, but rather why. What could drive someone to leave their partner trapped in a suitcase, recording their pleas for help instead of offering assistance? 10 days of intense courtroom drama would unfold as prosecutors and defense attorneys painted starkly different pictures of what happened that fateful night. The prosecution's case hinged on perhaps their most compelling piece of evidence: the cell phone videos showing Torres's final moments trapped inside that suitcase. As these videos played in court, Torres's desperate voice echoed through the courtroom. "I can't breathe." His repeated calls of Boone's name, growing more urgent with each passing moment, proved too much for some family members to bear. Several had to leave the courtroom, their audible distress prompting Boone's defense team to request a mistrial. A motion Judge Michael Kranick would ultimately deny. But the defense had their own story to tell. They portrayed Boone as a domestic violence survivor, presenting photographs and video evidence of previous abuse she had suffered at Torres's hands. Both parties had prior arrests for domestic violence, and at one point, Torres had been subject to a no-contact order. Could this history explain Boone's actions that night? Taking the stand in her own defense, Boone testified she genuinely believed Torres could escape the suitcase. She claimed when she saw his hand emerge, she struck it with a baseball bat, fearing he would attack her as he had done before. She instinctively reacted to save her life, her attorney argued, displaying photos of Boone's previous injuries to the jury. The prosecution, however, turned this narrative on its head. Could Torres himself have been the actual victim of abuse? They repeatedly returned to the damning video evidence, where Boone's response to Torres's pleas was chilling. "That's on you." The state argued that her words and actions showed a depraved state of mind, far removed from self-defense. For the jury to reach a guilty verdict on second-degree murder, they needed to believe beyond reasonable doubt that Torres was dead, that Boone caused his death, and that she acted with a depraved mind. As prosecutor Dave Cacciatore told the jury while pointing to the suitcase that became Torres's coffin, Jorge Torres was murdered in this box. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Sarah Boone was guilty of second-degree murder. The speed of their decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom, not least to Boone herself, who appeared visibly shocked by the outcome. But should she have been so surprised? According to her defense attorney James Owens, he had strongly urged Boone to consider the plea deal offered by the prosecution. Speaking after the verdict, Owens revealed that his client had been convinced she would face, at most, a lesser charge. It was a gamble that would prove costly. What makes this case particularly tragic is how it might have been avoided. The evidence that sealed Boone's fate had been captured on her own cell phone, the very videos that showed Torres's desperate pleas for help, trapped inside that suitcase, would ultimately lead to her conviction. The jury clearly saw what Boone herself refused to acknowledge: this was no accident, no act of self-defense, but a deliberate act that showed a complete disregard for human life. Now facing up to life in prison, Boone awaits her December 2nd sentencing date. The conviction brings some closure to Torres's family, who endured 4 long years waiting for justice, their wait extended by Boone's multiple changes in legal representation. But can any verdict truly bring peace when a life has been so senselessly lost? The simple game of hide and seek that turned deadly will now have lasting consequences, not just for Boone, who will likely spend decades behind bars, but for 2 families forever changed by the events of that February night in 2020. As we reflect on this troubling case, we're left with some haunting questions about the nature of domestic violence and the fine line between victim and perpetrator. Could this tragic outcome have been prevented if either Boone or Torres had reached out for help earlier? What drives someone to cross that threshold from a troubled relationship to a calculated act of violence? The videos that sealed Boone's fate paint a chilling picture of those final moments. The sound of Torres's desperate pleas, combined with Boone's callous responses, tell us something profound about human nature and the darkness that can consume us. But they also raise important questions about responsibility and accountability in domestic violence cases. Did justice prevail in this case? While the jury seemed convinced, delivering their verdict in just 90 minutes, the complexity of domestic violence cases often defies simple explanations. What do you think about the speed of their decision? Was this a clear-cut case of murder, or were there shades of gray the verdict couldn't capture? If you've been following this case, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was the rejection of the plea deal Boone's biggest mistake? And what message does this verdict send to others trapped in cycles of domestic violence? Join us tomorrow for another gripping case from the criminal justice files, where we'll explore an equally baffling mystery that has left investigators scratching their heads for decades. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the most shocking crimes happen right next door.
Hey listeners, welcome back to The Real Crime Diary. I'm your host, Sean Dupree. If you tuned in last time, we had a deep dive into the disturbing history of power abuse across different eras, looking at the connection between dominance, control, and how it plays out even today. We touched on scandals from the past and compared them with some modern-day examples, showing how these patterns of abuse, unfortunately, persist. One of the most insightful tools we've explored to understand this is my book, Power, Pleasure, and Pain: a study of abuse through time. It's not just a historical account, but an interdisciplinary approach to understanding why this keeps happening. We draw from history, philosophy, and modern case studies to explain how figures like Dominique Pellico, Harvey Weinstein, and others have exploited their positions of power for their own gain, often protected by the very systems meant to stop them. Recap of last interaction. In our last live stream, we discussed how libertinism, philosophically introduced by figures like Marquis de Sade, has shaped the way power and pleasure have been entangled throughout history. This concept ties directly into how figures like Weinstein operated, as we saw parallels between de Sade's fictional characters and the way powerful men manipulated their victims in real life. You guys had some amazing comments, asking how societal structures have allowed these behaviors to go unchecked for so long. It's a crucial question, and one that the book addresses deeply. Why this book is valuable. Now, what's powerful about Power, Pleasure, and Pain is its ability to break down these historical patterns and link them to the present. You're not just reading about ancient Rome or Enlightenment philosophy, you're seeing how these ideologies are alive today. The book uncovers how sexual violence and control have been systematically woven into the fabric of societies from ancient times right up to the modern era. It's about understanding not just the individual predators, but the systems that protect them, whether it's in royal courts, religious institutions, or today's corporate and entertainment worlds. Through these historical lenses, we also explore movements like #MeToo that are beginning to dismantle these structures. The fight for justice is far from over, but as the book demonstrates, we are in the midst of a cultural shift where legal reforms are finally addressing these long-standing issues. It's more than a history lesson. It's a guide to understanding and supporting change today. What's next? If you want to dive deeper, I suggest picking up Power, Pleasure, and Pain, a study of abuse through time. It's available now, and trust me, it will change the way you think about power, pleasure, and control. We've even got some exclusive content coming up on the channel where we'll be exploring the book's case studies in even more detail, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to The Real Crime Diary so you don't miss any updates. Let's keep this conversation going, because understanding the past is key to changing the future.